Hey, thank you, everybody. This is really exciting for us to be here and presenting to so many of you. We don't need to introduce ourselves now, do we, Lynn? Sean's done that for us, so that's quite nice. So we can go straight into the first slide. I say that, if it works for me. There we go.
There you go.
So generally, this is a section that I always start off with before talking just about the language that we will use throughout the presentation. So we will use identity first language. The title in itself is Autistic Girls, really portrays that. And that's just because that's the preferred way. Over 90% of the adult autistic community will prefer identity first language. This is obviously a personal choice and personal preference. But we feel it's really, really important that the autistic community are listened to and that their voices are used to inform those that are supporting autistic children. Drop the disorders, are just an obvious one, goes without saying, really. It's not nice to be deemed as disordered in any way. It's particularly important for children and young people. It doesn't support positive self-identity, which is what we're all about in the work that we both do. And I talk about a discovery, not a diagnosis. Diagnosis is associated with illness or something being wrong. So when I work with young people, I talk about them discovering that they're autistic, and discovery's got a positive association of excitement and exploration, a journey of discovery I quite often talk about. So we'll quite often use the word discovery or identification interchangeably with diagnosis, just because in our work with young people, we're all about that positive self-identity. And so some of that just needs a bit of a tweak sometimes.
Yes, I think language is really important, isn't it? And the more we as adults practice that language, that really communicates something really special to our children that we work with. That we hold those in a high esteem, that they're not wrong, they're not broken. And interestingly, Hilary, an autistic lady who works with me, likes to call it autistic spectrum design. The D is for design. I really like that. Which goes on very nicely to this, doesn't it?
It
So,
does.
yeah, trying to come up with a definition of autism is really quite difficult because every autistic person is different. But what we do know now is that it is a different way of thinking and processing the world, and particularly the way senses take information in about the world. And autistic people might also process internal thoughts and sensations in a different way, and that's kind of what we've tried to put together on our website. And Dr. Luke Beedham, who we both hold in great high esteem, and Jodie has worked with him on a master's course, talks about a hardwired difference in the way an individual thinks and responds to the sensory environment. So it's good to really be clear of our foundation of what we're talking about here.
And I think the biggest thing that sort of comes out of these definitions, and like Lynn said, it's a difficult one to define, is that both of these talk about differences, not deficits. And there's so much around autism, this really inaccurate narrative of a deficit model of autism, and we're fiercely trying to move away from that because it's inaccurate and it's certainly not good for positive self-identity. So we're all about autism being a difference, not a deficit.
Okay, I've had a comment saying that I can't hear me very much. So I've pumped up the volume. I'm hoping people can hear me better now. Hopefully that will work. If not, I'll lean a bit closer to my microphone. But if it continues to be a problem, I can put a microphone on. So we'll see how we go. We're looking at girls today for many different reasons, and thinking about historically, if anybody's read the Neurotribes book, there's a fantastic history of where we've come from and how we've got to where we are around identifying and understanding autism. But historically, it was studied in boys right from the very beginning. You might have heard of Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger, and they really kind of honed in on males, and then therefore they thought it was a rare male condition right from the very beginning. Do you want the next one? Yeah. So therefore, that has a knock-on effect of looking at the criteria being male biased and male behaviours. So autism diagnostic criteria has been picked up on the male criterion behaviours, and even judging it through behaviours has been a real problem through us missing those who don't actually display those particular behaviours, which we're going to come up to quite a lot today.
And I think the frustrating thing about this is that really, really early work, which was really narrow in its depth and certainly in its scope, is still the basis of the diagnostic criteria.
Yeah. So it just has that knock-on effect, doesn't it? That psychologists then are just looking for those things and missing those who, or the males and females who similarly fit that sort of very narrow criteria. But what's really happened in the last 10 and definitely in the last 5 years is that more and more women have come forward showing that they identify as autistic, they've had diagnoses, and there's been a lot of research around that and explaining to us how autism is for them, and that's been really important.
So Dr. Moyes has done an incredible piece of research recently looking at the autistic or the girls that are missing from secondary education. So there's a whole host of girls that are just missing once they get to secondary years, and Dr. Moyes decided to do some research into this, and what she was finding that these girls, these autistic girls, were actually quite likely or more likely to be persistent absentees. They were less likely to be referred for assessments, and they were certainly less likely to be referred to specialist services. Yet the reason why they weren't able to be in school was because of the challenges that they were facing in that setting. So in comparison to boys, these girls were accessing less in terms of additional support, and certainly not having their needs met in the same way. And the lost girls, so there's been further research around something called social camouflaging, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And it talks about girls who are evading diagnosis, or almost purposely hiding their true selves. And there's some real issues with this, because actually these girls aren't hiding somewhere. These girls aren't evading diagnosis, and that actually essentially that's victim blaming. In that the reasons why these girls aren't discovered is much deeper than that.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to say that often it's far too late when girls are identified, because actually they link to their mental health issues, that they crash and they burn and then something's picked up. But if we'd have just got in sooner and understood them, then actually we could have put those support services in much earlier. So the fact that too little too late is a big issue that we're dealing with, and Jodie deal with this on a daily basis in our work. I work in high schools quite regularly where we're just coming up against girls who have difficulty with their mental health, or they've dropped out of school, and when we dig into it, it's actually quite obvious that they are autistic.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for the young people, the children that I support, I've got probably around 85% of the children that I support are girls, and usually have hit some level of crisis point, really heightened levels of anxiety, often persistent absentees, unable to manage school, quite often in autistic burnout, which we'll talk about further on, before they are identified as autistic. And that comes with so many challenges in terms of then unpicking for the child who they are and what their identity is, because their autistic identity comes at the same time as them feeling quite rock bottom, and the association then is that being autistic actually means feeling like this, which isn't good.
This is you, Jodie. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm just taking it in. It takes me a little while to process what I put down some time ago and what I was going to say about it. I've got notes in front of me. So yeah, there's this thing that's known as female autism. I can't even say the word, Lynn. Say the word.
I can't either.
We'll just say FAP. It's referred to as FAP in the autistic community. That somehow autistic girls are some other species or some different type of autism, or very, very separate and different from autistic boys, and it just doesn't exist. It's not true. I work with autistic girls and boys, and they're all autistic and they're all children, and that's it. And as we've already discussed, the reason that this FAP has come around is because actually the current identification diagnostic criteria only ever focused on a really, really narrow group. So it's not just the girls that are being missed, but it can be other groups as well, because that don't fit that original narrow criteria. And for me, I think one of the biggest things is that if we are missing lots of autistic girls, we're likely also missing lots of autistic boys. And when we are, as we are talking now, we are talking about autistic girls. Everything we're talking about here applies to autistic people, autistic children. The gender is just a small thing. So if what we go on to talk about, you have some relatedness with autistic boys, or boys that it's quite likely that yes, that needs to be acted upon and investigated, and you need to be curious about what's going on for them as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, around statistics and things, because we've had all sorts of statistics. For every one girl, there's 10 boys, or if 1 in 4 was a big statistic for a long while. And I truly, truly believe that we're going to even out those statistics, that there's going to be equal numbers of boys and girls. But both Jodie and I have shared together about how many boys that we work with who have this same identification as the girls, where they hide and that they're hidden away until some crisis comes up, and they've been missed through school for the same sort of reasons. So it's really important that we're really clear about that. We're not just talking about girls and boys. We're kind of hopefully widening your view of autism generally, and just again understanding that it is a way a person thinks and the process things and experiences the world, rather than a set of behaviours. And certainly those sets of behaviours are not something we should be judging autism by.
Yeah.
Too wide otherwise.
Interestingly, there was some studies or research, I can't remember where I read this, it was for one of my assignments, and they looked at the male-female ratios in children. It was 1 in 6, 1 in 4, something around that. And then actually when they looked at the female-male ratio in adulthood, it was 1 to 2. So which just truly shows how there are so many girls being recognised so much later on, that we know that the average age for identification for girls is much older than what it is for boys. But equally, like we said, there's likely a fair few missing boys as well amongst this.
Yeah.
So we're going to do a bit of myth busting. So as Lynn said, we're hoping that part of what you take away from this is a different view of what autism is altogether, because this is why so many of the girls are being missed, and possibly more. So myth busting, autism is not lacking in empathy. We could say so much about this, couldn't we? We could probably do a whole hour on this alone. It's really, really common in myself, but also in the children that I support, that we have high levels of empathy. We have hyper empathy very, very often. Now, the hyper empathy is a big thing. This is a big thing for the children I support. This is a big thing in a classroom. If you imagine being hyper empathetic, so you literally take in every single emotion that's around you. So the child that's fallen and hurt themselves in the playground, the child that's missing mum, the child that's struggling with their work, the teacher that's stressed out because she's got 110 things to do. You can be taking all of that in, and you can feel that as if it's your own. You can feel that to the point where it can be overwhelming, and it can be physically distressing and physically uncomfortable. And obviously, if we are overwhelmed by that, sometimes we can go into shutdown, and we just shut down because it's too much. So we're just going to block it. Quite common in children that I support is that they're fixers. So they try and fix situations. Children that try and police the classroom in order to help support the teacher and help the teacher to feel less stressed. And of course, if you've got a child, you imagine a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old who's trying to police the class, the response that they then get from the other students, they make themselves really very, or don't make themselves, but they end up being really vulnerable to being picked on and being bullied. So empathy is different. It's empathy is a sense, it's a feeling, it's emotion. And being that autistic people, that we process differently, we will feel, sense and communicate empathy in a different way.
I think there's some as well link, isn't there, to the sensory responses to sensations as well, and emotion. So for some autistic children, they have a delayed response to that, and that they are picking up all that emotion, and then often it will be processed later when maybe things are quieter when they go home. And also there can be times when there's just a lot of confusion and you can't sort of interpret what's going on, and so you don't know how to respond. And it doesn't mean that there isn't that empathy going on. It's just actually, what you're expecting me to do with this, or what's the best thing to do. And I get a lot of girls and boys that I work with worrying about that. I don't know how to respond. I know that I want to, and they can often just carry that burden, can't they, because they haven't been able to.
Yeah. And actually, I've worked with children who feel very guilty that they're not responding in a way that is expected. A child whose dad was quite poorly, who said, I feel sad and I feel worried, but nobody thinks that I do, and so maybe I don't. So I feel then bad about that. And I think one of the big things is that emotions, as autistic people, we communicate differently. So therefore we express and communicate and feel our emotions differently. Therefore, the way that we will communicate and express empathy may be different. So it can look like, well, they're not really showing much empathy. Well, actually maybe we are, but in a very different way to what you're expecting.
I think that really links, isn't it, to the lacking in social motivation, which is a terrible myth, because the friendliness and the keenness to support and help other people and have friends is really high in most of autistic children that I work with. But I think it's a really good time to bring up, isn't it, Damien Milton's double empathy here, that actually this is a two-way thing, that an autistic child wanting to help or do something has a real social motivation in doing that, in helping others, and yet it's misinterpreted by others, and yet often it's the autistic child who's told off for misinterpreting the social situations themselves, and that happens both ways. But unless we balance that out, that's not going to be really helpful. And we judge our autistic children so much by what we think they should be doing, and it's that behaviour thing again, without really understanding the motivation around it.
And I think it's really important that anybody who is supporting, working with, parenting an autistic child is aware of double empathy. So in a nutshell, double empathy is the fact that actually autistic people don't have social deficits, they have social differences. And if you put a whole bunch of autistic people together, there's no challenges around social interaction and communication because we speak a slightly different language. And the emphasis historically has always been on actually teaching autistic child non-autistic language and non-autistic culture. The emphasis has always been on the autistic child to learn those skills and to abide by those social rules and skills, whereas actually what double empathy has done for the autistic community is said, hey, actually there's nothing wrong with how we communicate and how we socially interact. We just do it in a different way. And why is it all about us learning non-autistic ways when it actually should be a two-way thing, like learning a new language? And there's loads of stuff on double empathy, isn't there, Lynn? Like I would always advise people to go and have a good Google and look at Damien Milton's work around that, because it's really important. And again, and it feeds into that positive self-identity. And one of the things that I quite often will talk about if I'm working with a school or with a family around investigating the child, being curious about a child that we may be considering might be autistic, is I ask about their friends, like who are their friends, because actually autistic people, neurodivergent people do tend to gravitate towards each other. That's normal human behavior. We gravitate towards people who are similar to us in some way, and it might be that well, no, they, hear this all the time. Oh no, they can't be autistic. They've got friends, or they've got a best friend, or well, yeah, maybe they have, and maybe that child's neurodivergent too. So there's so much more to it, isn't there, that feeds into.
I was just thinking we could do another 2 hour
Yeah,
webinar.
we've only got an hour, couldn't we? To get through.
Yeah, I think we have already looked at, let's not look at sets of behaviours.
Yeah,
and I think this is why I've put up this little word cloud of, these are words from the Autism Diagnostic Manual, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and I hate them. I've been looking at them thinking, right, we need to get rid of these. But because
and these are what children hear, isn't it? When the child gets taken to the doctor. To all, to a pediatrician, to a GP, at every stage, this language is used.
And I think we have to be really careful what we are exposing our children to. When we talked about going to the doctor or whatever, they obviously they often just assume that then there's something wrong with me. So we need to talk about this really carefully. And we want to challenge. We go into schools and we challenge people about language all the time, because these words are wrong. They are really wrong, and the fact that they're judged on that to get the diagnosis is horrendous. So it's really important that there is some work being done on better diagnostic tools, but it's going to take time for those to come through. So it's not about deficits, it's about differences.
Oops, sorry, Lynn.
Sorry, carry on.
That's okay. Externalizers versus internalizers. Shall I let you start with this, Lynn?
Yes. So again, we often find autistic children who are late at getting identified are often those who kind of take their experiences and their difficulties and their anxieties and either internalize that, and we're going to look into this a little bit more. Particularly Jodie has some great stuff to say on this, where they mask it and they kind of the phrase that we hear from teachers is, but they're fine in school. And Jodie alluded to it before about fairness, doing the right thing, pleasing people, helping everybody out, because that's a way to cover up the fact that I'm struggling with this. We often notice the externalizers, those who go into fight or flight response to things, but it's the same panic, it's the same anxiety. I work a lot with my students around the science of what's actually happening to them when these things happen, the adrenaline and what's happening in their brain and their body. For those who want to fight or destroy things, and those who want to run away, it's a response to that high anxiety and panic. But there are others who internalize that, and so on the outside they look absolutely fine. And often they keep the lid on all through the day at school. And we say, well, but they're fine at school. We don't see any of that at school. And I know every single parent who is on this webinar now will be nodding, because what happens is the child goes home and I have a Coke bottle, and often when I'm training I take a Coke bottle with me, and all the time these anxieties come, they're being shook up all the day. And then what happens, you have to press the button, is that the lid comes off at home. And a child may have a meltdown, or they may shut down and be very, very distressed. And then it's a massive battle for parents to try and get schools to listen about what's really happening with this child, and schools to accept the responsibility for some of those things being happening in school. I mean, I'm really lucky that I get to work with schools who do listen and who work really hard to support girls in this way, but we know there's a lot of work to do.
And we know that this is common, again, for boys and girls. And I think one of the things to just throw in here, which is related, is that for lots of the children that I support, they have that in terms of their sensory processing, they have differences around their interoception. So for those externalizers, for those fight-flighters, they don't necessarily get the same sensations that things are building for them. So they don't feel the shakes of the Coke bottle. And I've worked with lots of parents and teachers that said, oh, they were 5 minutes and then they just flew off the handle. Or they need to tell us when they're struggling, or they need to ask for help. And actually, for so many, they don't feel those signals that things are becoming difficult. So they don't actually feel this build up. And if you can imagine being a child sat in a classroom and suddenly feeling out of control and suddenly going to fight or flight with no prior warning to that, generally people can say, oh, I'm not feeling good about something here. Oh, this is starting to feel really, really difficult. I need to get out calmly. Or if you don't have that, you never know when you might suddenly feel really, really not good. And then what happens is your body's triggered, your brain is triggered, you've gone into fight mode, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in the head teacher's office. So the anxiety that comes from not actually being able to recognize your own build-up is anxiety provoking in itself. And this is how so many of our children experience their days.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Sorry, I'm just checking my notes.
That's all right. I'll let you start on this one.
Gender expectations is around this very old-fashioned, I suppose, for want of better words, idea that girls have to behave in a set way. I suppose I'm no good with history. I'm suppose it's Victorian, in that girls should look a set way, they should behave a set way, they should be naturally very nurturing and caring and pretty, and pretty in inverted commas. They should be able to sit still, and they should be sociable. And then there's this idea that boys will be boys. And as much as what we'd like to argue against it, this still exists. This is still very much part of our children's upbringing, and our expectations that sit around different genders. And this is really problematic on various levels. I think it's problematic in that it increases the likeliness of masking for girls, because girls are expected to I don't know, I mean, how do you describe it, Lynn? Sort of maybe have more self-control from a young age, just expected to fit that very gendered idea of being female.
Yeah, I agree. I think you've explained it really well.
And I think there is
prim and proper, somebody said. Prim and proper.
Yeah. And I think this is why more girls mask. Simply put, there's more expectation to be in a set way.
Yeah, and also that does, as we work with teenagers, that just really impact on their identity as well. And obviously, as they're developing their sexual and their gender identity as they go through their teenage years, there's a lot more impact in confusion and thinking, I don't fit in, this is not me. And it's certainly important to know that, you know, there is a high proportion of autistic population who are LGBTQ, and actually not to put your own judgment on that really, and let them explore who they are. And remember that, you know, these societal norms are actually just made up things anyway. That, you know, I'm not a girly girl, and I'm not you know, and there's so many ways you can think of, well, you know, are you supposed to do this, are you supposed to do that? And actually the honesty of a lot of autistic people is, well, why should I be like that? And I think it's really important to help our teenagers, you know, really explore their identity so that they get the strength in knowing who they are, but being aware of this as well. And there is a lot of help out there, and adults who are writing about this. I know 3 books about gender and identity and sexuality from autistic authors that have come out recently that I've been really interested and enjoying reading. So, you know, that is just something we wanted to mention because that connects with that. And this is really, I want to thank A Second Voice, because actually linking with that is the cultural differences as well of expectations. So not only is the cultural expectations within for the girls themselves about, you know, either being quiet and prim and proper or in the background can happen in some cultures, but also the awareness of autism within that culture can be an issue as well. And those attitudes to autism can be quite negative within, you know, all cultures. But there are certainly, again, do look at A Second Voice. They've got a lot of really good work looking at Black culture, Chinese culture, and, you know, really helps us see that if we're working with a family within those cultures, then we need to be aware of their cultural expectations and understanding. Um, Identification may not be accepted by families and communities, so there's often where there's a tight community, it might be either hidden or you know, dismissed by some, or people might not want to let their community know that their child has that identification. And also professionals, we can have our own biases against cultural differences as well. There's not as many professionals from those cultures, but also there are things like, you know, the quiet, compliant Muslim girls or loud, rash Black girls, which can actually hamper the identification of their being autistic. And, you know, that there's culturally the training for service providers, which is one of the reasons why I've been doing a lot of training over the summer with A Second Voice for my own professional development, so that I know that when I'm working with families I understand a little bit more. And the main thing is the right questions and the right conversations to have with girls within different cultures, and just understanding the pressures and the awareness and the understanding around them as well. So I just wanted to add that in because that's really important, I think. Oh yeah, there you go. Parent blaming, I mean, that probably happens a lot. Oh, that again is probably another whole issue, isn't it? And a whole webinar. But sometimes we can many times jump to conclusions and think it is parents. You know, I hear it. I'm sure Jodie hears it. I'm sure Jodie's experienced it. When a child is behaving in school, but actually there's difficulties at home, it's very easy to jump to those kind of conclusions. So let's stop that and let's do more detective work and understand what's going on a little bit more.
Yeah, that probably leads us perfectly into me talking a little bit about masking, because it's really, really difficult when you've got a child who is masking in school. So masking, if a child is masking in school, that child can literally appear to be the perfect student, and I hear that, and I hear that periodic, you know, all of the time, from from parents that say, oh, we went to parents' evening and they said they're an ideal student. I've had it said to me about my own child, or if I had 30 of her in the class, oh God, it'd be brilliant. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't quite match up. So it's really easy for there to be discrepancies when you've got a child that masks. And I want to talk just really briefly about masking. I could literally sit and talk to you for 3 hours about masking, because it's a special interest of mine within my special interest of autism. But I feel really passionate that anybody who is working with or supporting an autistic child, young person, is aware of masking. And there's loads more information on my website, and talks and free resources and stuff around masking. So do have a look there. But essentially, masking is a suppression of self. It's a survival skill, and there's this idea that children can't mask all day, or that masking is a choice. Masking can be something that is subconscious, but also you can be conscious that you are masking, but it's still not a choice. There is so much that goes on behind or underneath the child that's masking. There can be, as we've already talked about, the people pleasing, the survival. It's essentially, in a nutshell, a survival strategy to avoid negative experiences. It's exhausting. It often results in children and adults losing their self-identity. So I've worked with young people who don't even know what their favorite color is anymore. They don't know what clothes they like wearing. They don't actually trust their own bodies anymore, and this is a really big thing. They don't trust what their bodies are telling them. So when their bodies are telling them that something feels uncomfortable or is too loud, they've been made to believe that that's an incorrect message, because when they've tried to, I'm just trying to think of an example. So when they've put a pair of socks on in the morning and those socks have been uncomfortable, they may have been told, oh, just keep them on, you'll get used to them. Oh, they're fine, them ones. You wore their ones yesterday. Or if they are sat in a dinner hall and it's too loud and they cover their ears, or express that something's too loud in some other way, they might be told, oh, you'll be fine, it's not that loud, you'll get used to it, you've only got 5 more minutes, just finish your lunch and then leave. So actually, autistic people lose trust in what their bodies are telling them, because somebody else is telling them that what they're feeling can't be right. And this is masking. This is where it comes from, and it's incredibly damaging for mental health and self-identity. But like I said, there's so much more that I'd love to say on this, but with the time restraints we've got, I think just to be aware that masking is real, it's a thing, and it's not a positive. I heard it the other day. Somebody said, oh, well, if they're masking, that means they're coping, so that's brilliant, isn't it? It means they're managing. And I was like, no, couldn't be further from the truth. It's not sustainable.
I did some research into the early years and girls, and one of the things that really came apart is that masking is not really a conscious thing, but it's something that's kind of imposed on the child from a very early age.
Yeah.
And that, even in the early years, girls are picking up on these signals, and boys are too, because there are boys who mask, aren't we saying? But actually, it becomes part of their socialization in a way as they grow up, and therefore, as you say, by the time they get to key stage 2 or teenagers, then there's so much to unpick, and actually finding themselves in amongst that takes a lot of support and a lot of counselling at times.
So on my website is a talk that I did with Kieran Rose, who's the autistic advocate, who's fantastic and incredibly knowledgeable about masking, and he does a few minutes speech. It's just incredible. It sort of makes you cry every time you hear it, and it describes a child masking literally from a baby, and it's him, and it's so poignant and just so powerful. There's this idea that children can't mask from you know, they can't mask, they're too young to mask, but exactly how you just described, Lynn, that happens from babies. And I think it's just, we need to be more aware of this and the impact that it has.
Yeah.
But I move on, otherwise we'll just keep going on that. oh, I've got some things on there. Which is basically, so it's not just about social camouflaging, which we've already touched on, this idea that autistic people mask to fit in because they want to fit in, because they just want to be like everybody else. Like that is just so inaccurate. And it's not just about fitting in, and it's not just about camouflaging yourself socially. It's so much more than that and much deeper than that.
Can I say something about that, really? Because it comes across with a lot of the children I work with, time and time again, is that, you know, it's that they don't want to be seen as different. And that is the fear, isn't it, around fitting in? It's not that I just want to be accepted. It's actually the onslaught of putting your head above the parapet in a group of young people is really, really dangerous.
Yeah, really unsafe.
It's unsafe, and it marks you out for being bullied and all kinds of things. So actually, it is actually very, very traumatizing just to have to do that every single day.
Yeah.
It's not just a simple fitting in thing. It is about survival.
And it's exhausting.
Mm. There you go. So there, it's just backed up by Jackie Ashton-Smith from the NHS. This was something that, you know, was said a long time, quite a few years ago now, about the social echolalia. And one of the ways of working out that masking is actually, again, confusion around what all the social rules are and what people mean, and whether something's important or not, whether, you know, those people laughing behind their hand or laughing at you or not. And one way of kind of trying to do that safety and fitting in is actually copying what other people are doing, mirroring others. There have been autistic women who've talked about how they kind of take on personas of other girls, so that again they can be that person in that place. One of the girls I worked with told me a story about how at playtimes she used to imagine she was a character out of she was about year 4, year 5, a character out of one of her stories who was confident and bold. And then when she went back into class, she could be that confident, bold person that she'd practiced to be. And, you know, that was unraveling even at year 4 because she was finding it so exhausting. And so it's an interesting concept, is that social echolalia.
And I've met lots of girls who, when I'm sort of screening things or talking to parents, they'll be like, oh, she watches a lot of YouTube. Oh, okay, who does she watch on YouTube? And that's really interesting, because quite often it is these sorts of programs or these people who are deemed very popular, socially very popular, and you can see this almost merging of, you know, I've worked with children that have started to speak in an American accent because the person that they are observing and the person that they are studying has got an American accent. And again, you couldn't sit down with one of these girls and they wouldn't turn around and say, well, I watch this person on YouTube because she's really, really popular, and I want to be like her so I don't get bullied at school. It's not it's not as obvious. It's so much more subconscious than that, I think, isn't it? But it's, again, it's you know, and that's just what, for me, social echolalia and social camouflaging is just such a small part of masking, just almost a small aspect of it. There's so much more. There's suppressing of stims, there's suppressing of emotions, or actually, as Kieran talked about, which hadn't sort of obviously occurred to me, but it's the person that plays the class clown. We all talk about that being an act, don't we? We talk about that being an act to hide insecurities and this, that, and the other, and that is another form of masking. It's not being true to yourself and who you are, and it's a way of staying safe.
It was interesting on your slide earlier as well that the word bossy was up there as well. How many girls are accused of being bossy or being a good organizer? There's one. You know, again, that is part of the coping mechanism. And
Yeah,
if I control this, if I'm in charge, then I can manage that, because
yeah,
that's a predictability that I
yeah.
need. And unpredictability is a huge cause of anxiety. So some children go down that route where if I control things and I can manage things, and you know, be the boss in a way, then that is a way of dealing with it.
Mm. So mental health and burnout. So autistic burnout, again, is commonly talked about in the autistic community, commonly known about really in the autistic community, but is less known about it in, I think, in services that support children, autistic children. I think historically, well, actually, no, still the case now. In terms of when you are being screened for autism or assessed for autism, there's often questions about regression. And actually, I think what the autistic community are coming around to now is that aggression is actually burnout. And burnout can lead to a loss of skills, whether that be a temporary situation or a permanent situation. And I just, again, it's one of my things now, because so many of the children that I work with who mask end up doing what I describe as hitting a brick wall, where they just can't do it anymore. And it can happen so suddenly that it can be a shock for families. It's a shock for schools, where they had this seemingly very able girl that was, or boy that was attending every day and the model student, and there were some few issues at home, meltdowns at home, but you know, on the whole things were going okay, and then suddenly bang, that child just wakes up one morning and cannot get out of bed. They cannot manage their self-care. They cannot manage so many of the normal daily functioning that they're expected to do. And it's frightening. It's a really frightening place to be as a parent. And for schools, you know, in my experience, schools are a bit sort of confused by it. Well, what do you mean she's not coming to school? You just need to get her here? Or, you know, I've worked with schools that very openly say, which is actually a brilliant starting point, is we don't know. We don't know what we can do for this child. We don't know how to help them. And I think I am seeing more and more burnt out children. And it's really about understanding masking, understanding the autistic experience, the day-to-day autistic experience, that will, the more understanding we have around the autistic experience, the more likely we are to be able to prevent children from getting to this stage. I think lockdown has had a massive impact on the levels of burnout that we're seeing, in that during lockdown we had a really extended period of time where for many autistic children, being at home and being fully unmasked was actually really, really comfortable and became the norm for them. And so they weren't able to put that mask back on and carry on with it as they had done before. You know, which in some ways is positive, because the unmasking has happened. But really, really frightening place to be. And again, I can't talk, I do a 2-hour talk on autistic burnout, and I can't put that all in here. But there is more stuff on my website about it, and on Kieran Rose's website has got a brilliant blog actually about burnout. So quite often this is when, as we've discussed, this is when girls, but boys as well, gain their identity. And actually, when you look at the diagnostic criteria for autism, for me, the boxes that you need to tick actually are an autistic child in distress and not coping. And it almost has to get to that stage before you can access an assessment at times, which is just so wrong. But again, another conversation altogether. So sometimes at the point where you're in burnout, this is where you suddenly find out you're autistic, and then you've got this negative association, like, oh my gosh, like I'm autistic and this is how I feel, and this is, and I can't manage, and I'm not even managing to get to school or look after myself. This is my life now. Brilliant. Burnout can obviously often be mistaken for depression. It can look very much like, it can mimic depression, but it also can co-occur. And I talk a lot about how finding your tribe is so important for positive mental health and positive self-identity, but this is really hard for a lot of the girls that I support, because there's lots of other girls that haven't got that identity yet or haven't been recognised. And I went to look at a school recently that is got a really good reputation for supporting autistic students. It's not a specialist, it's a mainstream school, but just developed this really good reputation. And I said, so how many autistic girls have you got in year 7? And the Senko said, oh, we haven't got any autistic girls in year 7. And I was like, and I turned around quite sort of without really thinking before I spoke, and went, oh, what, you mean you haven't got any that have been recognised yet? And he just sort of looked slightly puzzled at me, because I thought, that's just not the case. You have definitely got autistic girls in year 7. This is a really small mainstream secondary school. You're going to attract those children that just have those needs, even if they've not been formally recognised. But it is really, really difficult, because I know for me, having the experience of having autistic people and being part of the autistic community and having that around me has been so positive. And I just really want our children to have that experience too, but that can be really, really difficult. And I think there's also the flip side of that, in that some well-meaning organisations might say, oh yeah, let's set up an autistic girls group. Yeah, brilliant, let's bring all these autistic girls together. But that could be really problematic, because just because they're all autistic doesn't mean they're all going to get on. So it's really about having that in-depth experience and knowledge of individuals, rather than just the autism. To be able to put that together, that was all a bit disjointed, that piece there, wasn't it? I think it was just me in a hyper focus throwing some things at a page.
No, it wasn't. It just linked together so much. And I think, it's so sad that so many girls and boys are coming to burnout. And I think we've got to work really, really hard. And it's the sort of work Jodie and I do in schools, of really making schools aware as a whole staff, to look out for girls and to actually give them permission to be themselves early enough so that burnout doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I know so many, I've been kind of seeing little bits of comments that have been going, so many people are here because this is where they've got to. And it shouldn't have to be like this. Girls don't have to go through this. And I just my friend Dean Beadle, who talks about autistic joy, that's where our children should be, in a place of joy and self-expression and being able to be themselves. So we've got a lot of work to do, but there's not only Jodie and I on it, there are other people too. And I kind of am slightly encouraged by there has been progress in the last 15 years that I've been doing this job. However, we've got a long way to go. And the more we hear about burnout, the more we have to talk about it and help people understand, we don't have to get to this point. Let's not, as much as we can. And I think
it is really, isn't it? It's that understanding and awareness and acceptance that burnout is real, it's crisis point, and we don't want children to be getting to that stage, because when we are at that stage, recovery can be really long and really difficult, and there isn't really the systems in place to always allow that to happen. So recovery from burnout requires lots of very, very low demand, safe, comfortable environments. Essentially, it's being at home in your PJs, engaging in activities that do bring autistic joy, and engaging in special interests. But the difficulty for children, as an adult, if you were in autistic burnout, you'd be signed off by the GP. It's very difficult to get a child signed off. Like I describe it as, what this child needs is stop the world, I want to get off. Attendance policies don't allow for that to happen. health services don't allow that to happen. EWOs don't allow that to happen. So there's so much against children recovering from burnout. And actually, you know, so many of the families that I work with will quite often end up not electively home educating, because it's not elective at all. It's having to home educate because that's the only way they can give their child exactly what they need in that given time. And that's frightening. That's frightening when you suddenly say, right, that's it, we are stopping the world and getting off, because the implications financially for families, caring for a child in burnout is a 24/7 job.
But it's important we do, isn't it? And
Yeah,
find that way that's right for your daughter or your son to do that, because then, you know, you can help them. If they can recover at this time, then actually they'll be stronger adults, we
yeah,
hope.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
I think we better move on. Looking
Yeah,
at
we
the
had. I
time,
just
because we
sorry,
will
like,
do. I
so
think we know. Yeah.
there's
Sorry.
issue with it.
Are we right to keep going for a little bit, Sean?
By all means, honestly, be our guest, and you can see from the massive amount of feedback we've already had via the Q&A and the chat, people are really engaging with this. So
That's good. Well, there's
I'm
just
sure
a little bit now to go into
Yeah,
what can we
there's
do.
just a few more
absolutely.
slides that
I'm
we'll
sure I
try and
speak for
run
everyone to
with
say,
you.
please keep going. All right.
Yeah, I know we do this, but you know there is an issue around clinical professionals not being trained in girls. That is starting to get better, but the number of times Jodie and I have both come up and goes, she can't be autistic, she gives eye contact, or she can't be autistic, she gives
Yeah.
her friends. So really, you know, we and others like us will put that evidence together with families, and that's important. It's actually putting the detail there and using that research that's been done about girls to actually put into your report and to say, well, actually this is the case. So, you know, use that masking research to explain your child as you're going through any assessment as well.
And I think one of the big things, and this is probably a bit brazen for me to say, is there is a lack of professionals, not necessarily clinical professionals that are actually trained in autism, or not trained in autism but trained in the autistic experience. And I think there's a big difference there. A lot of the autism training that is out there, the big birds, you know the big training providers, the government funded ones that get pushed out of colleges for free, it's so outdated and actually so damaging, some of it. I got sent some screenshots of some questions of somebody doing some sort of autism level 2 training the other day, and I was like, no, it was just frightening. So we have to, so we're all trained in this narrow autistic criteria, and that needs to be broadened. We need better mainstream training, which is sort of what we do, isn't it, Lynn?
Yeah, well, I say, come to Jodie and I, we'll sort you out. Yeah, and it's that careful question, isn't it? And really digging down and getting to know the girl, and that's the sort of thing we love doing, isn't it? I love getting to know my autistic young people. It's just such a joy, really, even if they're struggling, to really get to know them and for somebody to listen to them and understand them. I hope they appreciate that. Okay, what's the next bit? Yeah, there is no typical autistic person, which we've been saying all along.
And this is why training in the autistic experience is vital, because every autistic person's experience will be different. Okay, so we thought we better throw in a few sort of solutions. So a few ideas, a few sort of practical things, and actually I talk about this in every single talk I do, because it's applicable across the board. And I put together this, is it an anagram where you put some letters together? I can never remember. What is it called?
Don't you're asking me a question there, sorry.
I don't know. Sorry, I put you on the spot there. Whatever it's called. So if we can just care, then this is a really big step into making change for these autistic young people and children. So we have to be curious. We absolutely have to be curious. When we see a child, or when a child is presenting a certain way, or when something is happening for a child, we have to be curious. We have to dig deeper. We have to give them a safe space to explore what's going on for them, and not just make rash judgments. And collaboration. I mean, this is key, particularly when you've got a child who is presenting differently in different settings, is we have to work as professionals, parents and child together, all together. We have to make sure the child's voice is heard in all of that. And everybody talks about that, but it's so often missing from autistic children. Particularly if they are collaborated with in a place that doesn't feel safe. So when I asked them what they think about school, I took them into the staff room, and they said that they're fine and they love school. That's not the environment where a child is going to actually share that information. Bearing in mind, these children are quite often people pleasers. They're going to tell people what they want to hear, and they're good at that, and they're well practiced in that. So collaboration, we have to work with parents. We have to listen and believe parents when a parent says that my child is struggling, or that they're finding this difficult, or, well, I can't understand how they're managing the dinner hall all day, every day for an hour at school, when I can't take them into a restaurant because that's so distressing for them. We have to really get better at that, in my opinion. Acceptance, we have to accept that what the child says is true for them. We can't belittle it, we can't invalidate it. If they are saying something is not good, it's not good. And believe me, the autistic kids that I work with are brave, they are resilient, they will push themselves to the bitter end. So at the point where they are saying, no, I can't do this, this is too much, I'm not feeling good, they're really not. They're really, really not. Recognition, we have to start recognizing these kids and what their needs are, and we have to broaden our idea of the autistic experience and what autism is, in order for these kids to be recognized, and for their needs to be understood. And empathy of experience, which sort of sits perfectly along acceptance. We have to have empathy for it as well. We have to know that the experience that they're having is quite horrific a lot of the time. And there's something that I should have posted on. Oh, did I do it further along? I don't know. And that alongside that empathy has to come the recognition that actually for us, for the sensory distress, and sensory is such a big part of the autistic experience, the sensory distress that we feel in certain situations, we can't just get used to that. We can't just be forced into that and be okay, or you'll get used to it, because actually all that does, desensitization doesn't work. It just causes further trauma, or it causes that child to mask, and it causes that child not to trust what their body's telling them. So that's really, really important.
I love that quote that you've put there, just really believing a person and how they see it. And for anything to support and help an autistic girl or boy, it has to come from their experience first, and an understanding and empathy of that. You've got to work from that. And that's where, using what they do like and what they are good at and their strengths are really important. Communicating in a way that is right for them is important. So, sorry, shall we go on to the next one?
No, it's fine. I was going to sort of say something similar, is that we've got to remember as well that communication is different. So don't expect the communication always to be of the verbal kind. And we have to accept the communication that's coming our way, however that looks.
And we have quite verbal children who seem to be really academically able as well. They can, we can assume so much, too much about what they actually are processing and understanding. And, lots of children have told me the ways they get around that. Through copying other people, or pretending something, or making it up, or actually feigning illness. There's all sorts of ways of not actually admitting that I don't understand what you've just said.
And also, I mean, that leads us nicely on to the next slide. But for me, that communication, that's a child not necessarily able to understand or recognize their own challenges or struggles, but their body's communicating it to them, and they're communicating it to us. And I think we have to accept that communication looks different, but it's equally as valid.
Yeah, these things are really just general things, are just a snippet of what actually can help. And often girls say to me, you know, it's unpredictability that's really difficult as well to cope with, because you're assuming they understand what you mean. So clear communication is really important, and just generally communication systems within the classroom that accepts difference and isn't quick to judge any child about what their response is. So if often as teachers we want to we ask a question and it's rhetorical, we want a specific answer, and why bother really? I always ask. So we often shout down or just kind of dismiss answers that don't fit in with what we were expecting, instead of going with that. Things like that can be really disconcerting for girls and boys who are really trying to join in and
And also
contribute.
trying to, it's exhausting, isn't it? If
Yeah,
somebody's
yeah,
communicating in a way where you're expected to read between the lines, you know, and actually, you know, many autistic people, we can do that, but it's the mental effort that it takes.
yeah.
And I hate it when I'm talking with somebody and I'm literally sat there going, right, I don't know whether you're being sarcastic. I'm not too sure whether I should be reading it more into what you said, and that's exhausting and really anxiety
Yeah.
provoking. I just avoid those sorts of
Yeah,
people.
I know. Just want to say a little thing about communicating through social stories. I have a big bugbear about these, and the reason I do training about them is that actually they're used in really wrong ways sometimes to tell people what they ought to do. They are not. They are a story that explains things starting from that person's perspective and experience, just to help them be able to cope and understand something better. And actually, social stories can be written about the situation from the autistic person's point of view, so other people can understand that. So please, if you're ever going to use them, please get some training, and ask me about it. I can help. But generally, it's just there's lots of communication things, and there's also a lot of things around sensory differences as well. Jodie's brought that up as well. It's so important that we recognise their sensory needs and that we put those support in place. And it might be sensory breaks or a sensory diet, need for movement, for example. We might not be able to get a proper sensory assessment, which would be great if you can. I mean, we have a sensory therapist that works with us, and she's completely stacked out with doing assessments for us because we see that as really important. But even if not, we can still understand and work with the child to be able to understand where are those key areas that we can really, the low arousal, just bring all that sensory impact down as much as possible, and just really understand that child's sensory needs and sensory triggers, so that we can make the environment and our communication and the interactions easier to manage if they're not coping with all that sensory overload as well. Busy classrooms I have an issue with.
Yeah,
Mess.
I was trying to encourage people to be curious about children's stims, and we know that
Yeah.
sometimes those stims might be mastered in school. So again, the collaboration with parents, but kids are actually incredibly good at regulating themselves through their stims. Really really good at that. And if we can be really curious about our child's stims, and that can really tell us what it might be that we can use in the classroom to support them. That's really, really important, I think. Just to say something quickly on interests to be followed. So there's a lot of pathologizing around autistic interests, passionate interests, special interests. In the diagnostic criteria, they're called obsessions. And obsessions gives you this sort of mindset that they need to be limited, or we can't let this child get obsessed with this, and actually it's so inaccurate and so damaging. There's a really good piece of research which I keep talking about by Dr. Rebecca Wood, who looked at using special interest within the classroom and within education, and in a nutshell, the outcomes were really, really positive, in that using a special interest within the classroom, within education, actually increased engagement, increased academic progress, but most importantly for me is actually increase the child's enjoyment of school. So do have a look at that. And that also sort of leads me into me talking about monotropic thinking. Autistic brains are really monotropic in nature, in that we can get really, really lots and lots of joy from the hyper focus that that we can have with certain subjects or certain things. And I'm not going to talk any more about that, but again, there's lots of stuff from Kieran Rose. I think Kieran Rose does a whole training talk on monotropism, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Again, be aware of it and do your own research on it, because I haven't got time to talk about it here.
Yeah. So really, sometimes our autistic girls do need some scaffold around their social relationships, just to check that, you know, there is a very mutual understanding of each other, and that they are friends with other children who are kind to them and understand them. And just a little bit of scaffolding can really help that. One of the girls I was working with in a secondary school just said to me this, that a perfect friend would be someone who I could just hang around with at school, who would understand if I don't want to talk to them and just get that I am different. And, you know, just the insights she had into what kind of friend would make a good, what kind of child would make a good friend. And it is about mutual understanding. It's not about forcing friendships. It's not about, oh, you know, this would make a good person to be a friend with, so, you know, let's lump these two girls together or whatever. But really, in a whole school, there should be a whole approach to awareness of difference and acceptance amongst each other. But then on that more subtle level, we should never make an autistic girl feel that she has to be friends with somebody, or that we are taking pity on her and making a friend, but actually working with those she might naturally gravitate to, and if she needs some scaffolding, some support, just giving them what they need. Sometimes that might just be a little time to stay in and have a chat with the teacher while they do a job at lunchtime, just to check they're in and they're okay, and that will be different. And as Jodie has said before, accessing their tribe. One of the things we're going to move on to is looking at books, and actually sometimes, you know, I've passed on a book to an autistic girl where there's been a character she you know, connects with, and we've had a wonderful conversation through that. And yeah, I'm going to sneak in quickly and say Roses, and Jodie's daughter's book is just amazing for that. Yeah, I think I've got a copy, look, as well. I buy them and pass them on. So let's have a look at some books. I know there's loads more we can cover, but we've just put a few little books together that you might be able to.
Just something to throw in there as well. Dr. Jo Billington's doing a brilliant piece of research at Reading University for her part of her PhD. This is her PhD, isn't it? And she's actually looking at autistic children's experience of mainstream school. And one big thing that came out of it, which I really like to talk about, because I just think it's so simple but so important, is that for autistic children, having one really good friend at school is an incredible protective factor, in that it offers that child protection, which this is going to sound horrific, but protection from bullies. If you're not alone, if you're with one other person, it makes you a lot less vulnerable. But secondly, the academic support that offers. And I know in a lot of schools that I go into now, they are very keen on moving kids quite frequently, changing talk partners every week, or moving the kids around. But actually, for some of our autistic children, that couldn't be further from helpful. I think the whole idea for schools is that it encourages children to learn how to communicate with different people, you know, ready for the workplace and all of that sort of stuff. But actually, school is so difficult for these kids that we have to focus on, you know, we have to prioritize, I suppose. And actually these kids sometimes do need to be with one other particular child that they can engage with, and they can say, I'm a bit stuck with this, or what did the teacher just say? Or it was a school I went into where these two girls were just like so had such an amazing friendship, and they were so good for each other. But school, like, we've separated them because they've become really over reliant on each other. And I was like, and then the child stopped attending school. But actually, again, this is about access to their tribe. If children are naturally gravitating towards each other, there's a really good reason for that most of the time. And like I said, it can be a really important protective factor. So again, be curious about that.
Good. Lots more. We could say that's another thing we could do 2 hours on, isn't it? So yeah, there's loads of books written by autistic girls and with autistic girls characters in, and by autistic women. So you know, these are just a few of them. Have a look, and these are great books to have. There's loads more, and I can't keep buying enough books. I'm reading them, they're amazing. It's just great we have this. And remember that these things apply to the boys as well. So I think
all of
it's
these
important.
books will, like, people have asked me, oh, you know, is Rose's book just for girls? And I'm like, well, no, because Rose isn't a girly girl. She's autistic. Like, what she's written applies to all genders. So you know,
so that's Alice Rowe and Tanya Marshall. These are the girls from Limpsfield Grange. They've written books, and Rachel Lucas, that lovely book State of Grace.
I like that one.
And you know, we just pass these on and let the girls read and identify with somebody who might be like them, and that leads to lots of good conversations. These are more about the up-to-date research and things. I think I wrote a chapter in one of those, the blue purple one, and but yeah, there's lots out there, so choose what you like. Obviously you don't, there's a lot, but I think that's probably our waffle bit.
Oh gosh, look, we've gone so over.
But we have time for questions still.
We do.